Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. Tonight, we enter the world of Sherlock Holmes, where an unearthed skull beneath an old London schoolhouse whispers of secrets long buried. Who was the victim, and who hid the truth beneath the classroom floor? Light a candle, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. The second chime of the school bell had barely faded when a soft, persistent knocking came from beneath our feet. It was not the sort of knock one expects on a door, nor a tapping that might be attributed to a servant's clumsy broom or some unlucky pipe expanding with the morning cold. This was deliberate, steady, as though made by knuckles pressed against the underside of the floorboards. Holmes's eyes flicked upward from his untouched slice of buttered toast, then downward toward the floor with a precision so swift I doubted he had blinked at all. We were seated in the modest receiving room of St. Ursula's preparatory school for young ladies, is a converted rectory with the charm of faded ink and the smell of dry plaster. Holmes had accepted the headmistress's peculiar invitation only because the wording of her telegram had intrigued him, an unspeakable presence beneath the chapel floor. We dare not speak of it, but the girls have begun to dream it. That was enough to ensure Holmes's interest and drag me, bleary-eyed and 3 spoons into my marmalade, into the very heart of Buckinghamshire's scholarly propriety. Again they knock 3 short raps. Then silence. The headmistress, Miss Percival, paled so visibly that even the grey ribbon at her throat seemed to recoil. I cleared my throat to mask the sudden thud in my chest. Miss Percival whispered, not looking at Holmes. It began a week ago, only when the girls are in morning hymns. Holmes did not speak. He merely rose, walked toward the edge of the carpeted dais and crouched. His fingers hovered like divining rods an inch from the floorboards. I could hear the sharp hiss of his breath, not from exertion, but focus. Then he knocked once, in mimicry. Silence, but then tap, 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 the reply came, faint and mirroring. Holmes turned to us with that restrained electricity in his eyes that meant, quite simply, that his mind had just leapt 6 steps ahead of us all. Not spectral, he said softly, not echo, not plumbing, a reply. Miss Percival clutched her wrist. It cannot be a person. That crawlspace is sealed, cemented even. The old crypt beneath the schoolhouse was closed during renovations in '74. Was it ever unsealed? Holmes asked without turning. She hesitated. I answered for her. Then that is precisely where we shall begin. The crawlspace had once been the crypt of the original chapel, its entrance now hidden behind a painted panel of St. Augustine beneath the staircase. Dust choked the hinges. Holmes took one glance at the paint, noted the fine crack along the arch of the saint's foot, and pressed his thumb into it. The panel gave. The smell of wet limestone and something older, something stubbornly organic, met us in a slow exhalation. Holmes ducked into the darkness first. I followed, and the lantern was raised. The space was barely high enough to crouch. Floorboards above creaked faintly with the movement of children far above us, now returning from chapel, unaware that beneath their polished boots lay a secret eager to be heard. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a thin tuning fork. He struck it gently against the stone wall, held it aloft, then touched it to the timber beam. He listened, then smiled. There, he said. That beam was hollowed and filled. Hear it? I leaned in, a soft, almost imperceptible rattle. Holmes took out his penknife. The blade found the softened groove between 2 planks. With surgical care, he pried. It was not a chamber behind the beam, but a shallow cavity. Within it, a child's leather shoe, impossibly small, and beside it, wrapped in old linen now browned with age, a narrow jawbone. Humans. The knock came again, only this time it was beside us, not beneath. The lantern shook in my hand. I steadied it with effort. Holmes turned slowly. He tilted his head as though listening to the very dust. Then, with the reverence of a man unwrapping a fable, he moved aside a fallen plank and revealed a narrow chute no wider than a man's shoulder, descending at a steep angle into utter blackness. "Air shaft?" I offered, though I knew it wasn't. He shook his head. "Conduit, built long before the school, pre-Reformation perhaps, used for secret confessional or escape." "But who's down there?" Holmes did not answer. He merely withdrew a silver coin from his pocket, struck it against the lantern, and dropped it. We listened. 3 seconds. 4. Then a soft, metallic ding, and what followed chilled me deeper than the air. The coin was returned. It landed precisely at Holmes's feet, and it had been scrubbed clean. He did not speak for several moments. Only the sound of our own breathing filled the low chamber. Then Holmes, quietly, as if to himself, "Someone is beneath us, someone who knows how to listen, and they have not forgotten how to cleanse." We emerged from the crawl space, and Miss Percival was waiting, knuckles white, lips thinner than before. Holmes addressed her as one might a student. "Miss Percival, there is a person likely quite old who remains beneath this school, concealed in its architecture, and who possesses knowledge of the dead child whose remains I now carry in my coat." She staggered. "You never said a child was missing," Holmes added, not as an accusation but confirmation. Miss Percival whispered, "Because we buried her 50 years ago." And then the bell rang again, but this time no one had pulled the rope. The bell's rope swung as if stirred by wind, yet the air in the vestibule remained still. Holmes stared at it for precisely 2 seconds, then turned to Miss Percival. "Who else has keys to the chapel?"
"Tower? Only myself, Mr. Trigg, the groundskeeper, and Sister Mavis, though she's been bedridden since Epiphany." Holmes's gaze drifted toward the spiral stairs. "Then either the rope has developed a conscience, or someone has anticipated our attention." He pivoted and strode toward the nave, his footsteps unusually slow, deliberate the way he walked when he was not chasing something, but waiting for it to notice it was being hunted. The echo of his boots clean against stone replaced the tapping we had heard below, as if the sound had simply risen from its crypt to follow us into daylight. I felt a prickling at the base of my neck as I followed him past the oak pews. The chapel was Spartan stained glass obscured by dust, hymnals neatly stacked on a side table, and a lectern that looked too narrow to support the weight of any serious sermon. Holmes stopped beside the organ. "Watson," he murmured, listened. It was faint but unmistakable, a hum, not mechanical, not vocal, the kind of resonance you get when air passes through a narrow vent, hollowed and curved like a throat long unused. He knelt by the base of the organ, pressing his ear to the floor. "There's another shaft here. The sound is climbing it." "And the bell?" He nodded. "Not a ghost, but a warning. Someone knew we had descended. They signaled from below. But how? You said the only opening was the crawl space." "Correction," he said, tapping the flagstone with his knuckle. "The only opening you saw." We reconvened in Miss Percival's office. She'd poured herself a sherry, though she hadn't touched it, and was thumbing through a leather-bound register, as though expecting it to bloom with answers. Holmes stood before the hearth, motionless. "You mentioned," he said without turning, "that the crypt was sealed during the school's expansion in 1874. Who was headmistress then?" Miss Percival hesitated, then removed a thin volume from the shelf and turned it to the last page. "Mother Eugenia. Did she resign or die in office?" "She drowned," said Miss Percival faintly. "They say she went for a walk along the river one evening and never returned." Holmes nodded slowly. Accidents have a peculiar fondness for the devout. He turned now, eyes alight. "May I see your admission logs for the year 1873, the girls' register?" "It's in the archive, but—" "Please," Holmes interrupted, already moving toward the door. The answers here do not rest with the staff, but the students. Someone entered this building who was never meant to be seen again. The archive was located in a locked cabinet behind the former vestry. Miss Percival's key turned with a metallic sigh, revealing an interior lined with ledgers of varying age and decay. Holmes scanned them in silence, pulled 3 from the top shelf, and laid them on the table like a gambler preparing his final hand. He opened the first, flipped a page, another. Then he stopped. Watson. I leaned in. A name had been crossed out. Not erased.
Blotted violently, the ink smudged into the grain of the paper. Beneath the smudge, just legible in the lamplight, Helena Marchant, 1873. She was admitted, Holmes said, but never withdrawn. No transfer note? He shook his head. No parent contact, no departure record. Only this obliteration done in haste, perhaps fear. Miss Percival gasped. Marchant. There was a girl's desk in the attic, labelled Marchant. One of the newer teachers said it was found during the renovations, but left untouched. Holmes closed the ledger with a soft snap. We shall see that desk. The attic stair groaned like a sleeping house, reluctant to wake. Dust swallowed each step. Holmes climbed ahead of us, his feet nearly silent, like a man retracing a forgotten dream. At the far end beneath the rafters stood a single desk, smaller than I'd expected. It bore no sign of rot or tampering. But what caught Holmes's eye and mine was what lay within. A diary, tied shut with a ribbon of blue velvet. Holmes did not untie it. Instead, he examined the knot. "Miss Percival," he said, "do your girls wear blue velvet in their uniforms?" She shook her head. Holmes drew a finger across the ribbon. "This hasn't been touched in decades, and yet—" "Look here." He angled it toward the light. The knot was fresh, tidy, the fibres crisp, tied by someone last week. My heart quickened. Holmes undid the ribbon, opened the diary, and frowned. The pages were blank, all but one. On the final page, in spidery hand, I hear them singing above. It is not a hymn I remember, but I know the words. They forgot my name. But I kept the bells. We stood in silence, the diary open before us, the chapel bell now an echo in memory. Holmes exhaled slowly. "The voice beneath this school is not a haunting, Watson. It is a memory preserved in brick and voice. And someone alive is helping it speak." The organ gave a single low moan from below. Not played, pressed. Holmes did not move, nor did he speak. He merely listened not to the sound itself, but to the silence that followed it. That, he said at last, was not a note. It was a message. Miss Percival clutched the diary as though it might answer him. But how can someone press a key from beneath the floor? He touched the velvet-covered binding in her hands. By knowing precisely which mechanism remains active. Is this organ's bellows system electric? No, she murmured. Manual! The bellows are beneath the chapel, behind the vestry wall. They've not been used in years. Yet they work, Holmes replied. Someone has reanimated them, perhaps partially, or enough to send vibrations upward. One key pressed a single chord of memory. I stepped forward, heart quickening. "You believe the girl Helena Marchant is alive?" "No," Holmes said, and his tone made the air seem thinner. "But someone is performing for her memory." We descended once more into the undercroft, this time with lanterns and purpose. The air had thickened less with damp than with anticipation. Holmes led, every footstep measured against the aural terrain. No further knock came, but the organ's key, once pressed, had left a vibration that still rang beneath my ribs. The chute we'd discovered earlier, the narrow channel that returned the coin, now drew Holmes's full attention. He crouched beside it, unscrewed the cap of a small vial, and let a single drop of oil fall into the gap. It slid downward in silence. Then he waited. Exactly 6 seconds later, a clicking noise emerged, not mechanical, more like the soft return of something metal against stone. He straightened. It's not a shaft, it's a dumbwaiter, or was once, designed for passing letters, food, communion, sealed for decades, then carefully recommissioned. I knelt beside it, peering down. And now, Holmes's eyes gleamed. Now it is a conversation. Back in the vestry, he located the lower bellows chamber. It was concealed behind what had once been a votive shelf, removed during the school's conversion. With Miss Percival's reluctant permission, Holmes removed 3 of the loose bricks. What we saw inside was almost beautifully grotesque. The bellows mechanism had been half repaired, cords restrung, levers oiled, and resting within the hollow, almost reverently, was a small wooden doll. Its eyes were missing, and in place of hair, someone had stitched a veil of old hymnal paper, looped like curls, scorched slightly at the edges. Miss Percival gasped. Holmes spoke before she could. This was meant to be seen, not found by accident, but encountered by anyone who truly followed the sound. He lifted the doll gently. Beneath it, carved into the underside of the wood, were 2 words. Me culpa. My fault, I translated aloud. Holmes nodded, or an imitation of guilt. And the paper? I asked. Why hymnal leaves? To mock the act of worship, Holmes said, or to protect something with borrowed sanctity. Look here. He pointed to a single word, scorched but legible on the edge of the curl. Sanguine. Miss Percival turned away. In the headmistress's office again, Holmes moved with silent speed. You mentioned Sister Mavis, the former music mistress. She has been ill since January, yes? Yes, said Miss Percival. She was eccentric, but devout. She taught the youngest forms until her collapse. Collapse? An episode during rehearsal. She heard the girls humming a tune she claimed was forbidden, said it belonged to a girl who never existed. After that, she withdrew entirely. She lives in the East Wing. I bring her tea once a day. Holmes placed the doll on her desk like a question. And she's never spoken of Helena Marchant? Miss Percival stared at the doll as if it might open its mouth. I thought Helena was only a scribbled name. A forgotten desk. It's impossible. Holmes smiled faintly. That word loses meaning in my company. Might we visit the sister? Miss Percival hesitated. She prefers the dark. The curtains have remained drawn for
months. I'll knock gently, Holmes replied. She is not the one I intend to frighten. The east wing smelled of dried roses and chalk. The air grew warmer the deeper we walked, as if the building tried to sweat out its memory. Outside Sister Mavis's room, Holmes paused not to compose himself, but to listen. A sound issued from within, not speech, not breathing, a rhythm, soft, steady, tap, tap, tap. Holmes knocked once. The tapping stopped, then resumed more slowly, as if measuring a heartbeat. Holmes opened the door. The woman within sat in a wooden rocker, her hands folded, face turned toward the window, though the curtains blocked all light. She did not look at us, but her lips moved. 3 steps to the altar, 2 to the crypt, 1 to forget. Miss Percival stepped back involuntarily. Holmes approached without fear. Sister, we found the doll, the one in the bellows. She lifted her chin. She remembers, she whispered. Who? The girl with the cracked voice, the one they silenced. Holmes's voice softened. Helena. Silence. Then slowly she nodded. She sang the wrong hymn. And they punished her? They erased her. Holmes drew out the diary and opened it to the final page. Did you write this? No. Then who did? The sister finally turned her head. Her eyes were clouded but not blind. She did. From somewhere within the floorboards beneath us, the organ gave a low, rising hum, not of music, but of breath returning to pipes long dormant. It did not fade, it climbed. The sound was not music, not truly. It rose like a question too long buried, vibrating through timber and time until even the dust in the sisters' room seemed to shiver with remembrance. Holmes tilted his head. That is a tune without a key. Sister Mavis did not blink. She hummed it alone for weeks, said it came to her in sleep, not a hymn, not in the register. And what did you do? I told her to silence it, that God does not tolerate invention. Miss Percival lowered her gaze. Holmes's voice, when it returned, was colder. Did she stop? The sister's hands tightened over her lap. She began to hum it under her breath, at meals, in the chapel. Then the others joined in. They couldn't help themselves. It wasn't catchy. It was inside. Holmes stepped back. How many girls? 5, all first years. They sang it round. Helena led them. Then one night she disappeared. I asked, and the others? Dismissed, the sister whispered. Or claimed by fever. I was told not to inquire. Holmes turned to Miss Percival. There is no mention of illness or withdrawal in the archives. She paled. Those pages are missing. Convenient, Holmes replied. Were any of those girls ever found? No answer. Back in the main corridor, the sound beneath us ebbed, but did not vanish. Holmes removed a folded paper from his coat and the page from the diary and handed it to me. Note the phrasing. I read aloud. They forgot my name, but I kept the bells. She identifies
herself with the sound, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. Identity here has been redefined. Helena Marchant was silenced not only physically, she was extracted from the school's memory. That is harder to achieve than murder. Miss Percival stood frozen. You think someone in this building has preserved her memory? I think, Holmes said, someone has preserved her voice. The music room was locked. Holmes picked it. Inside, the dust had patterns, not from recent use, but from a repetition so careful it formed habits. A stool was slightly worn on one side. A set of pipe whistles on the table showed traces of polished brass. Holmes moved straight to the piano. Look here, he said. The keys are all stiff, save these 5. He pressed them. They echoed, faint and clean. Then he played them in a sequence, a fragment of the tune we'd heard beneath the floor. Around this motif the rest was built, he murmured. This was Helena's phrase. She built a melody without harmony intentionally asymmetrical. Miss Percival blinked. But why? To be remembered, Holmes said, and something in his voice flickered. Or to encode. Encode what? He pressed the 5 notes again. Then he opened the piano's top. Inside the strings, taped with crumbling wax, lay a sheet of parchment. Holmes retrieved it. The ink was faded but legible. Lyrics, but not a hymn. It began, if no one calls me, I still ring, the sound of truth beneath the sting. He read silently, lips moving, then folded it again. She left a map, he said. In verse. I stepped closer. To what? To herself, Holmes replied, and the one who helped her disappear. The chapel was dim when we returned. Late afternoon light filtered through the high panes like stained regret. Holmes crossed to the altar rail. The lyric mentions 3 echoes, one beneath the choir, one behind the confessional, and the third. He paused, tapping his chin in the silence between. He knelt at the rail and tapped the stone beneath it, a hollow thud, then another deeper. He motioned to me, help me lift this. Together we shifted the ancient slab. Beneath it lay a velvet pouch. Holmes opened it. Within a silver locket, a child's prayer card, and a broken length of rosary beads. But it was the note tucked inside the locket that drew his full attention. He unfolded it, then read it aloud. You may bury me, but not my echo. You may silence me, but not my sisters. Their voices live where your pen could not reach. Miss Percival swallowed hard. She meant the other girls? Holmes nodded. The ones removed, but not gone. He looked to the rear of the chapel. "The confessional," he said, "the second echo." We reached it just as the light faded entirely. Inside the booth there was no dust. The wood was worn from recent touch. Holmes stepped in, ran a hand along the wall. Then he pressed inward. A panel gave way. Behind it, folded neatly on a shelf, lay 5 small hymn books. Each bore a name inscribed in faint pencil: Helena, Margaret, Agnes, Felicity, Rosamond. Holmes looked up at me. None of these names appear in the school's current roll. They were erased, Watson scrubbed from the records, but someone couldn't forget. A sound rose from beneath the floor again. Not a hum this time. A phrase, the same 5 notes are now joined by a 6th, higher, clearer, and from somewhere above us a second voice joined it. Holmes did not speak. He merely closed his eyes and tilted his head toward the ceiling, listening not just to the voices but to their relationship. One began low, tentative. The other climbed to meet it, as if echoing memories across distance. "It's a duet," he said quietly. "The second voice is not recorded. It's alive." Miss Percival clutched the list of erased names, her knuckles bloodless. "It cannot be. No girl on that list remains at St. Ursula's." They were all dismissed. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Were they? We returned swiftly to the staff registry, where Miss Percival's own records lay in neatly filed order. Holmes scanned the current enrollment log and stopped at the last page. "This girl," he said, pointing to a name scrawled more recently than the rest, "Eliza Rowan. 6th form. Transferred 2 terms ago, yes?" "Yes," Miss Percival replied. "Her records came from a convent school near Durham." "Durham?" Holmes murmured. "And yet her file is missing 3 pages. No parental contact, no references." "That's unusual," she admitted. "More than unusual. It's fabricated," Holmes said. "Rowan is one of the few names that appear nowhere else in your archive. It exists here solely and conveniently in this newest edition." He tapped the paper. "You did not admit Eliza Rowan. Someone inserted her." My mind flashed to the 5 names in the confessional. Could she be one of them? "She must be," Holmes replied. "One of them erased, planted back into the school with a new name." Miss Percival trembled. "But why return?" Holmes looked at her. "To remember, Miss Percival, where others have forgotten. We found Eliza Rowan in the north quadrangle, seated alone beneath the cloister. A book rested in her lap, unread. She looked up as we approached, her face calm, almost too composed for her age. Holmes gave her a soft nod. "A lovely place for sound, wouldn't you agree?" She blinked slowly. "It carries." "Especially in old buildings," he continued. "Some voices linger longer than others. Yours, for example, it's been joining others. A girl who once sang where no one else would." She said nothing. Holmes sat beside her on the stone ledge. "Tell me, Miss Rowan, is Helena Marchant your real name?" Her mouth moved just faintly, then stopped. He softened. "You needn't speak it aloud, but there are 5 girls in this school who once had names that were taken from them." "Yet they remained?" I watched the girl's fingers tighten on the book's spine. Her lips trembled. "We weren't supposed to remember." Holmes nodded. "But you did. They made us write new names, new birthdays. We weren't even allowed to speak the old ones, not even to each other." "And yet you sang," Holmes said. She glanced at him, and for the first time her face cracked, not in expression, but in age. The strength was learned, not natural. "She taught us the tune before they took her. Just 5 notes, but they never left, even when we forgot what they meant." "And the diary?" I asked. Her gaze lowered. "I found the old desk in the attic. I tied it shut again. I hoped someone might understand." Holmes folded his hands. "Why now, Miss Rowan?" "Because the voice beneath the floor never stopped. We stopped listening, but she didn't. And who is she? Holmes pressed. Eliza looked toward the chapel. Sister Mavis hears her, always has. That's why she never left. Holmes rose. And who returned the coin? A pause. I did, she said. That evening we returned to the crawl space with Eliza guiding us. She led us not to the chute, but to a narrower aperture behind the vestry wall, concealed beneath a false panel of hymnals. The air there was warmer, metallic. She showed me how, Eliza whispered. The passages. Holmes climbed down first, lantern in hand. The shaft opened into a cavity no larger than a cupboard, but fitted with shelves, papers, threads, tokens of girlhood preserved like relics. There was a folded uniform yellowed by time, a small mirror, a slate with chalk-sketched verses, and in the corner a box. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside lay a skull, small, feminine, its jaw still intact, teeth faintly visible, and beside it a nameplate, faded but still legible. Helena Marchant. Miss Percival gasped. Dear God! Holmes reached for a slip of paper tucked behind the bone. It read, I am not beneath you, I am beside you. Listen when the sound does not stop. I was not erased, only buried. I turned toward Holmes. So she died here? Not dead, he said quietly. She was hidden. Her death was never reported because it was never permitted to be true. And the person who hid her? The bell above us began to chime, but no one had touched the rope. Holmes did not flinch as the chime echoed down through stone and timber, deeper than it should have carried. He tilted his head slightly and timed the resonance on his watch. 7 seconds, he murmured. Too long for a simple swing. The bell was not rung. It struck. Struck? Miss Percival's voice trembled. He turned toward the shaft. From within. Likely the counterweight has been reconfigured. Someone beneath the tower has gained access to the underside of the bell, or to the mechanism that once lifted it. I stared up the dark shaft. But who would know how to reach it? Holmes's gaze returned to Eliza. She stood beside the skull box, her hands folded reverently. How long have you known it was here? Before I returned, she said softly. Sister Mavis brought me back. She said it wasn't finished. Holmes's eyes narrowed. She orchestrated your re-entry into the Baina school? Eliza nodded. She wrote to each of us, the ones who were dismissed, told us the time had come to remember her properly. And the others? I asked. They're here, not as students. Some are staff, a matron, one teaches embroidery, one cleans the bell tower. None of them speak about the past, but they all know the tune. And they've all heard the voice? Holmes asked. No, she said. Only Sister Mavis hears her clearly. The rest of us feel it. Holmes stood. It's not the dead we need to question now. It's the ones who tried to preserve them. We returned to the infirmary where Sister Mavis lay, but her bed was empty. A faint trail of black ash led from the hearth across the rug to the door. I knelt to examine it. Not ash-crumbled paper. Holmes brushed a flake with his finger. Hymnal parchment, he said, burned in strips. She's severing the evidence. Miss Percival rushed to the window. The chapel, the lights on. Holmes was already at the door. She's gone to the altar, and she's bringing her liturgy. We reached the chapel in time to see her standing at the lectern, a taper in one hand, the blue velvet diary in the other. Holmes's voice cut through the air, neither loud nor urgent, but so precise that it stopped her instantly. Sister, before you burn that book, tell me, what did you do to Helena Marchant? She turned slowly. I preserved her. In death? I asked. No, she said, in silence. They were going to cast her out. She sang a tune not sanctioned by liturgy. The Mother Superior called it heresy. And you disagreed? Holmes asked. I knew what it was, she said, almost to herself. Not a hymn, a code. She sang the names of those who were punished. She had no mother, no sponsor. She remembered everything. I couldn't let her be swallowed. Holmes stepped forward. So you hid her? I tried to move her. The night she was to be removed, she'd fallen on the steps, blood on her chin. I brought her to the crawl space until I could fetch a carriage. But she died, I said. She choked in her sleep, she replied. A blocked windpipe. I came back. Too late. Miss Percival's hand went to her mouth. And you never told the board? They would have covered it, she said. Called it rebellion. The church has never forgiven music it can't harmonize. Holmes stared at her. So you sealed her away, and wrote letters, and brought the others back. She held the diary up, so she wouldn't vanish. But why ring the bell? I asked. To awaken you, she said, looking straight at Holmes. I knew only someone outside the system could see what we hid. Holmes extended his hand. Give me the diary, sister. She hesitated. They'll close the school. I expect they'll rebuild it, he replied. And perhaps they'll allow the dead to be remembered by name this time. Slowly, she placed the diary in his hand. Then she whispered, She's still singing. Holmes looked up. No, that's the organ. We turned as one. The organ played its slow, ascending phrase, unmistakably Helena's tune, but this time with two hands. Miss Percival whispered, Who's playing it? Holmes moved toward the rear pulpit, steps quick and silent. There, seated at the bench, her fingers gliding across keys worn to memory, sat a girl I did not recognize. She was neither child nor woman. Her eyes were closed. As Holmes approached, she did not flinch. She's not one of yours? He asked. Miss Percival shook her head. I've never seen her. Eliza stepped forward. It's Rosamond, she said. And just then the music stopped. A breath, a pause, and from above the great bell struck once more, but this time it rang downward. The bell's echo rolled downward like thunder caught in velvet, not a warning this time, nor a summoning, but a reckoning. Rosamond's fingers lifted from the organ keys in one smooth arc, as though completing a phrase long denied its final note. She opened her eyes, and I saw the expression of someone who had not been summoned, but released. Holmes stepped into her periphery. Rosamond Hilliard. You were 11 when you were withdrawn from St. Ursula's under the charge of inappropriate mimicry. Do you remember the phrase? She nodded once. They said I was a danger to uniformity. You sang Helena's tune, he said. I did, she replied, and never stopped. They tried to correct it, but the tune was already part of me. Miss Percival came forward, slowly, as though approaching something holy. You disappeared from the records in 1874. How were you here? I never left, she said. Eliza stepped closer. But you weren't with the rest of us. I was in the tower, Rosamond answered. Sister Mavis hid me. I became the ghost they all feared. The one who rang the bell. My mouth dried. You've been living in the schoolhouse, in the passages, in the belfry. Sometimes in the chapel's roof crawl, she said. They fed me, protected me. They said my voice was too dangerous to be heard in the world. Holmes's voice was soft but edged with iron. They turned you into a memory. You became Helena's echo. I became her choir, she said, because the others couldn't. Holmes stepped toward the organ. And the mechanism, the duct to the bell? Modified, Rosamond said, years ago, before my hands were strong enough to ring it directly. Now I use the counterweight. And the tune, I asked, was never hers alone. She taught us how to hear it. It lives between notes. You can't write it down. Holmes's brow furrowed. Then how did she encode it in the diary? She didn't, Rosamond replied. She encoded it in us. Miss Percival sank into the front pew as though her knees had failed. You understand what this means? The board will bury us. No, Holmes said quietly. The board already tried. This is the unburning. He turned to Rosamond. Do you know what happened to Helena? The night she died. Rosamond looked away. We heard her coughing, then the sound stopped. When Sister Mavis came back, she wouldn't speak to us for days. Then she told us Helena had been moved to another school, but we never believed it. And when did the voice begin? Holmes asked. A week later, she said. From beneath the floor during the hymn, we all heard it. Just one note at first. Then 5, always 5. Eliza whispered, that's when I started dreaming in tune. Holmes turned slowly. Miss Percival, I believe it's time you took us to the tower. There's one chamber left unopened. Her face turned a shade paler than ash. The bell loft? It's sealed. Not to Rosamond. We climbed the stone steps in silence, our footfalls muffled by the dull chime still ringing in our bones. Rosamond led, barefoot, never touching the railing. The tower door opened at her touch. Inside, the great bell loomed above us, suspended not by a rope, but by a brass rod affixed to a counterweight lever hidden behind a stone panel. The air smelled of rust and rose petals. Holmes examined the mechanism. Elegant. This wasn't built by a child. Sister Mavis engineered it, Rosamond said, so the bell could speak when the girls no longer could. And it strikes downward, Holmes noted. Because memory falls, Rosamond said. We had to bring it back up. I turned toward the corner alcove where a wooden box sat beneath a broken stained glass window. Inside it lay a length of hair ribbon, a rosary bead, and what looked like an envelope sealed with wax. Holmes picked it up. The wax bore the faint imprint of the Ursuline crest. He broke the seal, inside a single sentence. When the bell rings, the school must answer. Holmes handed it to Miss Percival. That, I believe, is your obligation. She held the paper as if it burned. Rosamond turned to him. What happens now? That depends on you, Holmes replied, and how loudly you wish to sing. She stepped back toward the organ. Holmes raised a hand. Not yet. There's one voice left unaccounted for. A pause, then faintly, almost impossibly, from the open stairwell behind us, a new sound rose, a child's voice, humming. The humming curled up through the stairwell like warm breath on a mirror, faint but unwavering, a child's voice, high and tuneless, yet unmistakably echoing the 5-note motif. It held no fear, only insistence, as if memory itself had found new lungs. Holmes turned without hesitation and descended the steps 3 at a time, his coat brushing the stone in silence. I followed, heart pounding not from exertion, but from the eerie certainty that the voice we heard should not have been there at all. We reached the lower vestibule to find no child, only a shadow on the far wall, cast not by anybody, but by the lantern light catching the corner of the crawlspace grates. A silhouette shaped like a small figure, seated cross-legged, hands folded. Eliza whispered, "That's where she used to sit, every morning before lessons." Miss Percival stepped forward. "There's no pupil assigned to the lower dormitory corridor this term. The sisters closed it last autumn after the fire." Holmes knelt beside the grate. He pressed his palm flat against the floorboard and closed his eyes. Then he spoke. "You may come out. The tune has been heard. Nothing." Then a creak. A panel behind the grate shifted, and a small figure emerged, no taller than a music stand. She wore a faded uniform with the hem unevenly stitched and a velvet ribbon tied tightly at her throat. Her face was pale but not ghostly, her eyes fixed on Holmes as if she'd seen him before. He offered no greeting. "Your name?" "Helena," she said. Eliza drew in a sharp breath. Miss Percival gripped the pew rail behind her. "That cannot be." "She died," the girl blinked. "I know." Holmes did not move. "You remember your tune?" She nodded. "It's mine." I stepped forward, unsure whether to believe my own vision. "You're not a spirit." "No," she said. I'm the part of her they couldn't erase. Holmes's tone shifted not from disbelief, but deduction. You've been here the whole time. Not as the girl herself, as the idea of her, preserved, Eliza whispered. She's like a refrain, the part of the melody that returns no matter what verse is sung. Holmes nodded. A physical echo. He looked at Rosamond. You created this? I didn't invent her, Rosamond said, but I gave her space. A room, food, memory feeds on belief. We believed hard enough that she stayed. And the others? Holmes asked. Do they know she exists? They've all seen her, Rosamond replied. They just never said so aloud, because to speak to her is to admit she was never gone. Holmes stood slowly. A school with a child not counted, a voice not documented, and a death never confessed. Miss Percival's voice came as if torn from the back of her throat. What am I meant to do with this? Remember her, Holmes said. Formally, name her, account for her. She need not haunt what is recognized. The child Helena, or what was left of her, stepped forward. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a torn piece of paper. Holmes took it and unfolded it. It was the final verse of the song. Let the ones you cast beneath rise with names you dared not speak. If their silence built these walls, then their voices make them weak. He folded it and placed it inside his coat. Then he turned to Miss Percival. The board must be told. The remains beneath the floor must be transferred, honored, not hidden. This building cannot sing lies any longer. She nodded slowly, as though absorbing centuries of confession in a single breath. Holmes looked again at the girl. Do you wish to leave this place? The child's voice was soft. I can't. I only exist where they remember. And if they stop remembering? I asked. Her gaze flicked upward toward the bell. I won't ring, she said. Then she turned and walked back toward the grate slowly, sure and entirely without fear. The panel shut behind her, with the soft click of a piano lid closing. We stood in silence. Then from above faint, but resonant came the sound of a key pressed once more on the organ. The single note hung in the air like a held breath, drifting down from the chapel above, pure, unwavering, and impossibly clear. It was not melancholy, it was not a plea, it was a punctuation mark, the sound of a story insisting on its final sentence. Holmes stood still beneath the organ loft, his gaze fixed on the dark corridor where the child had vanished. Then slowly he turned to Miss Percival. There is a ledger beneath your desk in the administrative office. It's bound in green leather, the one with no index. She flinched. Yes. It was passed down from headmistress to headmistress. I've never opened it. Because you were told not to, he said. But that book holds the original names of those removed and erased. Not just Helena, the others too. Eliza's voice was steady. We used to call it the silent book. Show it to us, Holmes said, and his tone made it clear it was not a request. In the headmistress's office, Miss Percival unlocked a shallow drawer beneath her blotter. From it, she withdrew a ledger, its cover cracked, spine bowed outward, as if the weight of its contents had strained its bindings for decades. She laid it on the desk and stepped back. Holmes opened the center. There, between the pages, were 5 names, each handwritten in faint, deliberate script, and beside each a small cross. No withdrawal date, Holmes said, no transfer, no guardianship, no illness, just the names and the crosses. What do they mean? I asked. They mean these girls were no longer considered individuals, Holmes said. They were buried administratively, removed not only from the school but from its memory. Eliza stepped forward. That's how they tried to erase her, by closing the book on her voice. Holmes gently turned the page. The next entry had been written in a different hand. Shakier, older, it read, Memory lives beneath us, Do not open it unless you're willing to be changed by it. Holmes closed the ledger. You will deliver this to the bishop, he said to Miss Percival, and include the letter found in the tower, the remains beneath the crawl space, and the full list of those returned under assumed names. Miss Percival nodded. They'll shutter us. They may, Holmes replied, but it would be the first honest thing this building has done in 50 years. We walked once more through the lower corridor, where Rosamond waited beside the stairwell. She looked older now, not in years, but in stillness, like someone who had finally heard their name after years of being called something else. Holmes handed her the folded page of lyrics. Keep this. You may need to remind them again. Rosamond accepted it with both hands. Will they believe me now? They'll have to, he said. You made her voice louder than their silence. I only remembered, she replied. That, Holmes said, is often the bravest thing anyone can do. The chapel was quiet when we entered again. Sister Mavis had returned to the front pew. Her eyes were closed, her hands resting lightly on the hymnal in her lap. The organ loft was empty, no figure, no movement, and yet the bench creaked. Holmes paused mid-ale. She's here, he said. Listening, Miss Percival whispered. Then let her be counted. She walked to the altar and took up a sheet of parchment from the pulpit drawer. With trembling fingers, she dipped her pen in ink and wrote a single line across the top. Addendum to the roll of 1874 Helena Marchant, recognized. Holmes bowed his head not to a deity, but to the act of naming. That is the first note of peace, he said. Later that evening, Holmes and I stood once more in the tower. The mechanism had been disengaged. The bell was still. Rosamond joined us, carrying a sealed envelope. It's for you, she said. From Sister Mavis. She left it with me before she went into seclusion. Holmes opened it and read silently, then passed it to me. I feared memory more than death, but she sang it back to life. Forgive us our omissions. Will she be exiled by the church? I asked. Holmes folded the note. No, she'll be forgotten again, quietly, as always. And the girl? He looked down the shaft. She will remain until they no longer fear her. Just then, from beneath our feet, a sound, not a word, not a hymn. 3 soft knocks, deliberate, answered, moments later, by 3 more from above. The double exchange of knocks echoed through the stone, a symmetrical rhythm pulsing upward and downward, as if the school itself were breathing again for the first time in decades, without denial in its lungs. Holmes lowered his head briefly, eyes closed, then moved from the bell platform back toward the stairwell. They've begun answering. That was not a ritual, it was a choice. 2 people? I asked. Still below? 1 at least, he replied, and the other perhaps no longer hiding. We descended with Rosamond, who said nothing. Her steps were silent, her hand grazing the banister like she was drawing out notes from wood rather than air. At the base of the stairs, Eliza stood waiting, her arms crossed, her gaze not on us but on the chapel doors. They're inside, she said. Who? Asked Miss Percival, who had returned from the bishop's telephone with a face drained of pretense. The other names, Eliza whispered. They came tonight, all of them. Holmes paused beside the threshold. You mean the others who were erased? Rosamond nodded. She called them back. Helena! The doors creaked open before we touched them. Inside, 5 women stood before the altar. I recognized none of them, and yet somehow I knew who they were. One held a candle, another folded uniform, a third clutched a prayer card with edges worn thin. Rosamond stepped forward. You came. The woman with the candle answered. We never left. Holmes approached without hesitation. You've been watching, waiting for someone to unbury the tune. They nodded in unison. The
board will act quickly, Miss Percival warned. They'll send auditors, possibly even the Archbishop. We don't want revenge, the woman with the uniform said, only to be spoken of properly. Holmes turned toward the organ. Then let your names be heard. Rosamond sat without instruction and pressed the first 5 notes, Helena's motif. Then she added the 6th, Rosamond's variation. One by one, the others joined in. No music sheets, no rehearsal. Each voice entered not in competition, but in complement, weaving over and under one another in a cadence that defied any church's notation. It was not sacred, not profane. It was true, Miss Percival whispered. This wasn't a school, it was a mausoleum. No, Holmes said, it was a vault, and now the vault is open. As the melody reached its apex, one voice, softer than the rest, slipped through neither from the organ nor the choir. It came from beneath the floor. Eliza gasped. That's her? The final note felt a clean, unbroken tone that hovered for 3 seconds. Then silence. Holmes bowed his head. She's finished. Rosamond wiped her eye with the sleeve of her dress. You mean she's free? No, Holmes said. You are? In the days that followed, swift inquiries ensued. Miss Percival, to her credit, submitted the ledger, the envelope from Sister Mavis, and a full written confession of the burial and concealment of Helena Marchant. It was not out of obligation. It was something more solemn. On the 3rd day, the bishop arrived. He spoke to no one at first, only walked the corridors, laid his palm upon the chapel's stones, and stood before the bell rope for nearly half an hour. Holmes and I watched from the courtyard. I suspect he knows already, I said. He does, Holmes replied. He just didn't want to be the first to speak it aloud. The final reinterment took place under moonlight. The child's remains, skull, bone fragments, and ribbon were placed in a cedar box and buried in the school's rear garden. A stone was set, carved plainly, Helena Marchant, remembered. There was no procession, no sermon, only the 5 women, Rosamond, Eliza, and the 3 others singing a wordless phrase as the last shovelful of soil was pressed down. The bell rang once, not struck, not pulled, just acknowledged. Later, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. He said little on the train, only stared out the window with the faintest expression of a man watching the echo of a thing too deep to fade. Once in his chair, pipe in hand, he spoke softly. You know, Watson, the most remarkable thing about that case was not the skull, nor the diary, nor even the concealed passageways. No, he turned toward Mummy. It was that a building bound by silence could eventually choose to sing. Just then, from across the street, faint, impossible, a child's voice hummed 5 simple notes. Holmes stood perfectly still at the sound of the knocks, one set from below, one from above, as though some
invisible circuit had finally closed, not a loop, but a resolution. It's done, he said, softly. You're certain? I asked. He nodded. She's no longer trapped in the silence. She's joined them. Miss Percival approached from behind, a candle flickering in her hand. I've informed the board. There will be a formal inquiry followed by a full ecclesiastical investigation. They'll want scapegoats, I said. Holmes turned. They'll find none. This wasn't a crime of commission, it was a symphony of omission. And now that the final note has sounded, all that's left is to decide what the school becomes when the echoes fade. Eliza entered behind her, followed by Rosamond, who carried a small parcel in her arms. We brought this, Rosamond said, from the crawl space. She handed it to Holmes. Inside the parcel lay Helena's original music book, the one believed lost or burned. Its pages were brittle, but intact, inked in a child's looping hand. No lyrics, no staff. Only symbols, some musical, some not layered, like a puzzle. Holmes flipped through them slowly. This is no ordinary composition. She made a language, Eliza said. She said if they took her voice, she'd find another way to leave a message. Holmes stopped on the final page, drawn faintly in pencil, a symbol of the chapel bell. And below it, I murmured, the school's crest. Twinned, but reversed. She knew, Holmes whispered. She knew they'd turn their seal into her tombstone. Rosamond touched the page with a fingertip. She wanted to change it back. That afternoon, Holmes requested a final tour of the building, not for clues, for memory. We walked past the vestry, the confessionals, the choir stalls. We stopped beneath the chapel rafters where once a voice had risen from the floor, met by others who thought they'd been erased. "It's curious," Holmes said, "how often the oppressed leave behind not shouts or manifestos but lullabies." "She wasn't angry," I offered. "She was lonely." He nodded, and clever enough to know that loneliness, when passed down, becomes a kind of melody. We stood at the threshold of the crawlspace once more. The grate was now bolted not as a prison, but a memorial. A plaque had been affixed beside it. Here, unheard for too long, rested a child's truth. May no voice be buried again. Outside, the girls of St. Ursula's lined the garden path in silence. No teacher instructed them, no bell summoned them. They came of their own accord. Holmes and I stood at the edge as Miss Percival emerged with the amended roll-book clutched to her chest. "I will read the names now," she said. She opened the book. Her voice shook but held Helena Marchant, Rosamond Hilliard, Eliza Green, Agnes Forth, Margaret Teal, Felicity Grey. A pause. They are no longer absent. As the dusk fell and the girls returned indoors, Holmes lingered by the garden. "I believe this is where we part company," he said. "You're not staying?" I asked. He shook his head. No further deductions required. No more false suspects. Only remembrance. We turned to leave, our feet crunching the gravel in slow rhythm. Just before the gate, a soft chime rang out behind us. Not the bell. The organ, not played, sustained. One note, familiar, and then barely audible. A child's voice, Helena's voice, finished the tune.